So this is our session on safer recruitment, which is just an introduction really for parish officers. Some of you will be aware that we've had some new guidance recently. So it's just an introduction really in terms of the new guidance, but also broadly what you need to do. It's not a good start, can't get the slides to move. Okay, so what we're going to cover in this hour is what is safer recruitment and why do we need to do it? We're going to talk about the new guidance from National Church and what has changed as a result of that. And we're going to talk about what help and support is available. So as I said at the beginning, this is a fairly light touch session because we don't have much time, but there are other places I can signpost you to where you can get more information should you need it at the end of this session. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is think about what is safer recruitment, why do we need to do it, and how do we do it? So what I'm going to do is put you into small groups, and I'd like you to spend, let's think how long we need for this, about 6 minutes talking around those questions. So you're not going to be able to go into huge depth. But it's what is safer recruitment, why do we need to do it, and how do we do it? So it's just really to give you a brief opportunity to share any really good practice that you've got, and we can revisit some of that towards the end of the session as well. So if you just bear with me for one moment, I'm just going to put you into rooms. So you've just had some time in your small groups to think about what safer recruitment is, why we need to do it, and if you had time, what you're doing at the moment, if anything. So has anybody got anything from their group discussion around what safer recruitment is that they're happy to share with the rest of the team? Any thoughts? Don't all jump at once.
We're all shy. Yeah, it's a process that helps us safeguard, basically. Very simply words, but as well as it's a process that if everybody goes through, there should be a safer church that we have, and that we make sure they get the right person for the right job. Yeah,
absolutely. So it's that process that helps us safeguard those children, young people, vulnerable adults that we're working with, which, yeah, helps with safety, provided we follow the process. Yeah. Did anybody have anything else to add to that, or anything different?
We talked about in a way it's a fairer process, because if everybody has to go through it, so that, you know, if we've been through it as PSOs and in other roles, we say, well, we've actually been through it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it needs to be fair and consistent.
Yeah.
So we're not just picking and choosing when we do it, we apply it consistently. Absolutely. Yeah. Anything else that anybody wanted to add to that?
One of the things we sort of said in our group, or I said in our group, and there's no other way of putting this, is that actually sometimes the older members of the congregation find it a lot harder to understand why we're doing it than the younger members of the congregation.
Yeah, there may be some people that find it more difficult to understand, and I guess sometimes age is a factor there, because for some people who are perhaps engaged in employment in other sectors at the moment, they will be very accustomed to this way of working, because that would be a usual way of recruiting people now, whereas perhaps if you're someone who hasn't been employed for a while, it may seem quite different perhaps to things you've experienced yourself. So yeah, that could be a factor, couldn't it? Anything else that people raised around what safer recruitment is before we move on to the next question? No? Okay. So what about why we do it? Why did people think that we do it?
We spoke about trying to deter anyone from coming into church who you wouldn't want there, in order to protect others as well. So it's a process that's done so that we can make sure, like we said, that we've got the right person for the job. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. So yeah, it can be a real deterrent. We know that some offenders will use their employment or volunteering as a way to gain access to children, young people or adults who are more vulnerable, and we need to make sure that we put things in place so actually it deters those individuals from seeing our churches as a potential opportunity to do that. Okay, that's great. And what about how we're doing at the moment? What were people thinking around that question? And were people feeling quite confident in terms of the practice within their setting, or not confident? Let's have a show of hands. Who feels confident? Okay, so we have some level of confidence. Kate, I think you wanted to say something.
I said in our group, I was with 2 people from big parishes with big teams, operations managers. I'm in a small parish, no church warden, about 7 on PCC instead of the 14 we'd expect. And if you've got a very small team, I think all but one aged over 70, it becomes much, much harder, because completely what you've been saying, I actually spoke to our safeguarding officer today, said, you're coming on this meeting. Oh, no. And if you've got a small team in a small parish, most of whom have never done any recruitment, which I've done a lot of, it becomes difficult. If you've got a big team and you've got an operations manager, it's completely different.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that what Kate's fed back? Does that resonate with others as well? Kind of feeling like sometimes it feels like quite a big job that falls on quite a small number of people for some of you. Yeah. Okay. No, completely acknowledge that. Bev, I think you did. You
I was just going to say it's you could almost do with a parish safeguarding officer and a safer recruitment. You could actually do with a human resources person to take it on, because it's huge.
Yeah. And I think, it is partially a numbers game, isn't it? That, if you're a smaller parish, you're doing less recruitment anyway. So in terms of the recruitment operations, there is less of it going on. But the bottom line is that there's a certain level of infrastructure that you need, however big or small you are. So if you are very small, it can seem like quite a big job to get all of that structure in place, particularly if you're not going to be recruiting very many people, and it's likely to be the same 2 or 3 people that end up doing all of the work. So I think in terms of your work around safer recruitment, like with your safeguarding work, it's always worth thinking about what links and connections you have with other parishes, whether there are opportunities for cross benefits working, whether there's that element of sharing that you could have with others, so that you're not all doing the same work. Having said that, it's important that you contextualize what you're doing, and that what you're doing really fits for your setting, your environment. But actually, often if somebody else has done a job description for a particular role, it might mean you only need to do a few tweaks, and then you can use that, and it may be you've got something else that you could share with them. There's also some resources available online to help support you as well. Right, I've got a few slides to share with you just to go through those questions again. Just bear with me for a moment. If I press the right button, that would help, wouldn't it? Okay. There we go. Right, I can't see all of you now, so if you want to chip in as before, just shout out. That's absolutely fine. So we've answered those questions, so I'm just going to cover a couple of them, and then we'll cover the last one in a bit more depth. So what is safer recruitment? So as you've said, it's the steps that we take to ensure that the church is not providing unsuitable people with access to children, young people and vulnerable adults through roles within the church, whether they be paid or unpaid. As I said earlier, we know that offenders will seek out employment opportunities that enable them to gain access to people that they wish to harm. And having good, robust policies, procedures that are always followed can be a really good way of either deterring people or identifying them through that process. So that's what we're doing. In terms of why we're doing it, we want to make the church a safer place. We want to discourage unsuitable people from applying, and absolutely there's a really clear research base that shows that it really deters people from applying if you have these things in place and you apply them every time. It may identify people who may be unsuitable, and it will reduce the risks of harm. Okay. And how do we do this? We do this by ensuring that the appropriate guidance is followed. And as I said before, it must be followed all the time, consistently. What we also know is that people who wish to perpetrate harm, so abusers, can be very savvy and very manipulative. And actually, if you have some flexibility about how you apply the rules, they will always look to manipulate that flexibility to their advantage. What we have to accept is that it will not be easy for us to identify people who are unsuitable simply using our own instinct. So it's really, really important that we have a clear structure around that to help us to do that. So there is new guidance from the National Church, which is the Safer Recruitment and People Management Guidance, which was issued in June of this year. I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment because I just want to see, has anyone seen that guidance? Just hands up. No? Was anyone aware of it before this session? So a few people aware of it, and
Helen, I've seen it.
You've seen it, yeah.
I did start to read it, but it's yeah. Enough said.
Okay, wonderful. So not many people have looked at it, but quite a few people have heard about it. So that guidance replaces the previous guidance, which was issued in 2016. So everyone was familiar with the previous guidance. Is that? Yeah, excellent. Okay, I will share my screen again. Okay. So in terms of the new guidance, there is something quite significant that's changed that I'll come on to, but the majority of it is pretty much the same as the previous guidance, but it is presented in a slightly different way. And I think it gives greater clarity around absolutely who has to have the checks, what the checks are, and what your good practice is. So the requirements of the guidance must be followed for the appointment of all roles within a church body that involve substantial contact with children and or vulnerable adults. So those are the people that you absolutely have to cover with your safe recruitment approach. And that would always include members of the clergy authorised to officiate, readers, LLMs, lay workers, youth workers, and that could be employees or volunteers. And the other important thing, which may not apply to many of you, is that the guidance also applies to relevant roles that are performed outside of England. So people who are operating on behalf of the Church of England but overseas also are covered by this guidance. So if you have people who are going off to do other work elsewhere on behalf of the diocese or behalf of your parish, then they would also be subject to this guidance. It does define in there what's meant by substantial. I think you also need to take a risk-based approach at a local level, because you will have some roles that perhaps it could be argued don't have substantial contact, but they do have potential contact, which means that you are a little bit more concerned about getting absolutely the right person for that role. I would also suggest that you actually follow the steps for all workers, but you decide on a risk basis which of the steps you need to follow for each individual role that you have in your setting, and that will vary from setting to setting. The guidance is available as a downloadable PDF, or you can access it on the Church of England website as an e-manual. And I have to say, the e-manual is quite easy to navigate. You can go straight to the section that you want to look at. It's got some other bits and pieces in there, like toolkits, templates, resources, etc., that can help you with what you're doing. So do have a look at the e-manual that's available on the Church of England website. So broadly, you've got the section 1, which is the requirements. What must you do? You've got section 2, which is good practice advice. And the other helpful thing about the new guidance is that it does also give some further guidance around elected roles. So we have much less scope to influence who has those roles, but there are things that we can do to ensure that they operate as safely as possible. So please do have pay some special attention to that. And then, as I say, there's a toolkit and templates and resources, plus frequently asked questions. So please do have a look at the e-manual and work your way through that, and that will help you in terms of what you need to do next. There's also a self-assessment tool within that, which is incredibly helpful. And what I can tell you is that we're currently in conversations with the people who developed the parish safeguarding dashboard, which some of you I know are already using. Some of you, it may be being used in your parish, but you're not directly involved in that. But it's been very useful and a really good way of monitoring our safeguarding. We're talking to them about them developing a kind of bolt-on for that to help parishes manage their safer recruitment as well. So the self-assessment at the moment you can access in the same place as the e-manual, and you can use that. You can print it off as a paper version or save it and use it electronically. But going forward, we're hoping that we'll have a tool for that, like your dashboard, that you can have that kind of live audit and action plan in terms of where you are at with things. So hopefully that will be helpful. I'm just going to stop the screen share for a moment just to see if anybody has any questions so far. Liz.
Sorry, just finding the mute button. I just wanted to ask, and I might be jumping the gun here, but will you be talking about if there's any specific changes between the old guidance and the new guidance, just as a brief overview?
Yeah, so there's only one really significant change, and we'll just come on to that in a moment. Yeah. Kate.
This is fine looking to the future. What about if we have people in place in a role with children who've been in place quite a long time? Is any of this retrospective?
There isn't a requirement to do retrospective checks, but I think I would take a risk-based approach. So some settings have decided to do a kind of re-recruitment process for all staff and volunteers, so that they're starting from the same baseline with everybody. But that's, you can decide that based on risk locally, and if you want to get specific advice and support around particular roles, then do feel free to give us a call and we can talk that through with you on an individual basis. Yeah. James.
We have a number of retired clergy. I presume that there is a process for their permission to officiate that they go through, rather than the parish having to or needing to do this recruiting.
Yeah, so usually your your clergy and licensed people will have been recruited at diocesan level, and then you would know if you need to do any, if you're responsible for any of the ongoing checks. So for some people, the DBS checks would be a parish responsibility, but your lead recruiter or your PSO should know which people they're responsible for and which people we're responsible for at diocesan support services. But again, any confusion with that, just give us a call and we can check individual people to see who's doing what.
And
Okay.
can I ask a question, although
Yeah.
you may say this is too specific? What do you do when you, as a parish, are holding a big event and you are having volunteers from outside of the parish? It's an event that's been going on for years, and you've got volunteers coming from all over the place that again have been involved for years. How do you do that? Could we just do a risk assessment as to whether it's, because you know, I know if we start recruiting, they're going to just, the volunteers will just go. I know that. So it's, how do you deal with these big events?
So different settings do that in a variety of ways, and it does depend a bit on what the event is,
Okay.
who's going to be attending and what the roles are.
Yeah.
So a risk assessment, absolutely. What many people do is do kind of a group recruitment where people are going to be supervised. They get them together, they do a bit of a group recruitment piece, so that they're making sure that everyone's got the information they need, everyone knows who they need to talk to if they have a safeguarding concern, everybody understands that they absolutely should not be unsupervised with children or vulnerable people, and what they need to do if they have a concern. So you could cover it off that way potentially. That's quite a general answer because it does depend on what the event is and what the responsibility of those individual volunteers will be, but there are various models that you can use, but often that group recruitment is used. Sometimes people do get references. It just depends on what work will people be doing, how heavily supervised will they be, and what are the risks really, in terms of the vulnerability of the attendees, and whether, you know, whether children will be coming with parents or not with parents, that type of thing.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's all the questions so far. I'll just share my screen again and we'll come back together for more questions as needed. But as I said, do shout out if you need to. Okay, so this is the big change in terms of the requirements. I don't know if people had already clocked this or not. For some of you, you might have had a moment of panic then. I probably should have pre-warned you. So the big change is that DBS checks now need to be refreshed every 3 years. Previously, it was every 5 years. Which for anyone who works in any other sector where they need a DBS check will know that that was slightly out of kilter with other organisations. So some organisations don't refresh their checks, but the majority that do it every 3 years, not every 5. So I'm just going to bring us back together just to share any collective horror or concern around that before we move on. So were people aware of that change? Okay, so for some people that's going to be quite significant. So this new guidance becomes kind of active on the 5th of January next year. So you need to be thinking now, what is your plan to make sure that you're getting up to date around those DBS checks. For some of you, it will be a much bigger job than others. So for those of you in very large settings, potentially you have 2 years worth of checks to do as quickly as you can. So there is no expectation that things will just happen overnight, because that would be unrealistic. But what you do need to do is make sure you've got a reasonable plan to get those done as quickly as you can to catch up, so that you get to a point where you're on that 3-year cycle and you haven't got people who are outside of that. So for some of you, you'll be able to do that really quickly because you have a very small number of people who require checks, and you'll be able to just get those done. For others of you, as I say, that will be a much bigger job. So for those of you who are not PSOs or are not lead recruiters, you need to be really thinking about how you can all support those people to make sure that we can get this catch up done as quickly as possible. Liz?
So does that mean is that we could start doing it now? So the people we've got in 2017, we could start implementing it now? Because I've got about 20 to do, and if it's got to be done by January, you could argue I've got 20 to do in January, and then every 3 years I'm going to have you're going to have this big, it's a bit like the training, you're going to have a big bulge. So can we start doing the checks now?
Yeah, absolutely. Start doing them as
Right,
soon as you like. Liz G.
Yeah, it's similar to what Liz just said, but I was wondering if, so we can do whatever we can do as a parish and get the ball rolling on our side, but a 31A prepared for an influx of extra DBS checks that they're not, and do they have the staff to get this going so that we can make sure, because obviously we can do our bit, but then they've got to do their bit in order to get them back. And quite, I think stuff at the moment in a lot of places because of COVID, staff shortages are a thing. So I'm just sort of like throwing that one out there to see if they've been prepped and they're ready and they've got everything in place for them as well.
Yeah, so they're aware of this change. It's a really important question though, so I will make sure that we've gone back to them just to make sure that it's high on their agenda. In reality, probably things will happen at different times for different people, but as other Liz said, if you can start doing that work now and have a bit of a phased plan, then that will help to maximise the resources that we have available to us, both at a parish level, diocesan level, and at 31A as well. But if any of you are having any difficulty with the speed that things are going through with 31A, do let us know so that we can chase that up. So they're aware of the change, we can give them a reminder, but if you're experiencing difficulties or there's any significant change in the timescales that lead you to believe maybe that could be a resourcing issue, then do let us know and we can follow it up directly with them. Thank you. Liz?
Yeah, I was just thinking it's not necessarily 31, it's going to be the police checks, because I'm noticing things are taking longer to sort of to come through. So the bottleneck might not be 38 one, is going to be the police checks.
Yeah, and we always have peaks and troughs in terms of how quickly different forces deal with the checks, and it's often down to what their structure is and how they manage those. But again, any particular delays that you're experiencing, do let us know so that we're aware of where the difficulties are occurring. We can see how long things are taking, but it's really useful if there's been a particular problem, if that can be flagged up, then we can take action around that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to ask, our church is part of an ecumenical partnership. And I just wondered whether it's across all the denominations. I'm just a safeguarding officer for an Anglican church, but we've got Methodist, Baptist and URC as part of our ecumenical partnership. So have they got the same things? Have they? It's a national thing that we're dealing with here.
So this particular guidance is Church of England guidance. So it depends which safeguarding approach you follow. So normally if you're in a partnership, you will decide, okay, so we follow Church of England, or you follow
we follow the URC. We follow the URC, which makes it very complicated for me because all our people are on the URC master the spreadsheet really. So I have to communicate with the URC chap who's our partnership safeguarding officer. So I just wondered, it just makes it a little bit more complicated, I think, really.
Yeah, it absolutely does. So you would normally be following their safer recruitment
Yes.
procedures, but fundamentally safer recruitment procedures are based on what is considered to be good practice across all sectors where there is contact with children, young people and vulnerable adults. So you won't, well, you shouldn't find there were huge differences, and if there were huge differences, you should be flagging that up so that we could establish, effectively we need to establish who's got it wrong, because one of us has, because actually if you look at recruitment procedures, they're pretty similar across all different sectors. I'm just having a little look here in the chat. Oh, okay, thank you, Anton. So Anton's just flagging up that most police forces have a bit of a longer delay than normal at the moment, especially our local ones. So that's really, really useful to know. In recent years, the turnaround time has been much improved. I'm sure those of you who've been involved for a while will have noticed that. So yeah, hopefully even with a bit of a delay, hopefully things will still happen in a timely way. But I guess the key thing for us with those DBS checks is to be really organised, to make sure that we're on top of it. For those that we know are already more than 3 years, you know, they were done more than 3 years ago, let's start doing those now, so that we can work through them as quickly as possible. And any problems that you come across, let us know. For those of you who aren't the lead recruiter, I guess the other thing to say is this is going to be a bit of a job for the people who are directly involved in the DBS checks. So please, if they ask you to bring in your documentation or to do your bit online, if you can do that as quickly as possible and you can encourage others to do so too, that would be really, really helpful. Lead recruiters are already going to be dealing with this slight backlog because of the change, so they're dealing with more than usual. If they've also got to ask everybody 10 times before anything happens, it makes it into even more of a job. So those of you who lead activities and things, if you can get your people on board so that they're ready and poised to do their bit as and when needed, that can be really, really helpful. Okay, that everything on DBSs? Yeah, okay, we will move on. So that's the biggest change. Fundamentally, nothing else has changed massively, except for this issue around there being greater clarity relating to who absolutely can you not recruit in any way other than through the safer recruitment route, and what's your good practice suggestions. So once you've got that process in place for all of your most risky roles, you can then look at how you implement the good practice as well, and make all of your recruitment much safer and fairer. Just got something in the chat, so I'm just gonna check that. Okay, so Bev was saying that that they arranged a DBS coffee morning, and that worked really well. So yeah, perhaps if you can entice people with a free cup of coffee and a bit of cake, and get them to bring their documentation at the same time, and have perhaps a laptop or a computer available where you can do some of that while they're there, that might be a really good way of doing it. Thank you for that, Bev. I'm glad that worked well for you.
Yeah, it did. Cake always works, doesn't it?
It does for me.
Cake or wine?
Okay, so in terms of the steps, so this is also a slight change, but it's not a fundamental change, because what they've done is simply break down. If you remember, we used to have 9 steps for safer recruitment. There's now much more in terms of the number of steps, but actually it's all the same things. They've just been broken down into more categories. So it's not extra things that you need to do. It's just that before we had broader categories and now they're much more specific. So in terms of the steps of safer recruitment, the first step is around responsibilities and making sure that it's very clear who is responsible for each of each recruitment, and how that is going to happen. The second step is having the role description and person specification. So we've got some of those on our website. We've been trying to share some across the diocese. So if you have some amazing ones in your setting, please do send those to Adam Bond, and we can then make sure that we make those available to others. There's also some templates available with the new guidance as well. You then need to advertise the role, so that's the third step. Appreciate in a church setting, advertising the role is not always something that's done and can sometimes seem a little bit alien, but actually it can be a really good way of getting the right people and making sure that you've considered all possible options and get the best person for the role, because sometimes you make assumptions about who might be interested or who might not be interested, and actually when you open up that opportunity, sometimes you're surprised by who comes forward. You then need to make sure that people apply, and again there are pro formas for application forms. Again, if you've got one that you've been using that you think is really amazing and is working really well, then do feel free to share that. Some places have a different application form for paid staff and volunteers. Sometimes they have a different form for substantive posts and non-substantive posts, sometimes for leaders and not leaders. It's really whatever works for you. But I think throughout this process, you need to be thinking, how do I make this robust, but how do I make it accessible as well? So what you don't want is an application form that you need a PhD in order to complete, because you won't end up with a mixed team of staff and volunteers. You'll end up with a very narrow range of people, which brings risks in itself. So make sure that the process is accessible to people. We've got the confidential declaration, so really important element of the recruitment process, and the confidential declaration certainly is something that you need to be applying in those elected role circumstances. So again, as we talked about earlier, you don't have a great scope to influence who gets those roles, but you do have things that you can put in place to make sure that it's as safe as it can be. You need to shortlist for the roles. And I always think it's really important for you to plan your shortlisting and your interview, that we'll come on to in a moment, at the point that you are advertising the role. So plan how you're going to do that before you get the applications in. The risk of not doing that is that you get applications in and then you plan the process around the people that you've got, which can kind of make holes in your net effectively, because it then opens up potential opportunities for people to manipulate that process. So your shortlisting and your interviewing should all be based on what you want. What are you looking for? What does the person specification say? What does the job description say? How are you going to test that effectively? So make sure you've agreed all of that before you get to the point of actually looking at the application forms. You then have your interview and assessment, and that again is going to look very different for different roles. So for some roles it might be quite formal, perhaps with an interview panel and some kind of assessment. So I don't know, it might be, you know, youth leader role, you might have 3 people interviewing and be asking them to come and do a task with some young people, and getting feedback from the young people as well around the applicants. Or it might be more of a conversation if it's a less substantive role. Whichever way it's going to be, it needs to be proportionate for the level of risk, and it needs to be documented. So even if you're going for a less formal approach, you need to make sure you've written down when you did that, who was present, and you also need to make sure that you've thought about the conversation and the questions in advance of you actually doing that. You then need to do your pre-employment checks. So that would normally be around making sure that you have resolved any discrepancies. So things like on my application form, I said I worked somewhere between certain dates and had a certain job title, but that didn't tie up with the information that I gave you at the interview. You might want to resolve things like that. You would also be looking for references as well. So if somebody has employment or is in full-time education, then often references are fairly straightforward for them because they have somewhere that they can go and get those. You may have particularly volunteers who have not been in the workplace for a number of years or have not yet started their work career, and you need to think about what sorts of references you might want for them. It may be that for some people, really family and friends are the only people that they can ask. So you need to think about that and think about how much weight you place on those. But it is important to have those, and particularly if you've only got kind of friend and family references, it's often really useful to follow those up with a telephone call, just in case there's anything that they hadn't mentioned that they would like to mention, but also to thank them for doing that. If you're able to do that follow-up call for all references, then that's really good practice as well. We've then got the DBS check. Now, many people that you probably talk to in your parishes think that safe recruitment is DBS checks, and they're not aware of the other steps involved. So it's really helpful if you can go back to your parishes and do a bit of myth busting around that. DBS checks are a really important part of your recruitment process, but not every role qualifies for a DBS check or is eligible for a DBS check. And also we have to remember that your DBS check is a bit like an MOT certificate in that it only kind of says yes on this day, there is nothing known at the moment, or there is something known and then you have to explore that. It also doesn't help you with those people who perhaps have committed offences or are unsuitable, but that's not something that's been picked up in terms of intelligence or offending for them yet. So a really important part of the process, but we can't put all our eggs in one basket and say because we've got the DBS check, we've done everything that we need to do. We need to deal with any criminal records. So at any point during this process, somebody may disclose some offending, or you may be made aware of some offending. So that might happen at the DBS check stage, or it might happen at any other point during the process. And it's really important that you deal with that robustly. So if somebody says to you, oh, I've committed this offence or that offence, and I'm a bit concerned about it, make sure that you have those conversations. Make sure that you get advice from the diocesan safeguarding advisor, Adam Bond. Don't put it to one side and say, oh, well, let's wait and see if it comes up on your DBS and then we'll deal with it. You know, if somebody's made that disclosure, we need to have those courageous conversations and make sure that we have appropriately addressed it and risk assessed it. Just because somebody has some offending background doesn't mean they definitely won't be able to do the job. So everybody gets a DBS check. Some people have what's called a blemished check, which means that it has things on it. Other people will have a clear check. If it is blemished, you need to contact Adam Bond and you need to have conversations with him about that. If offending comes up in other parts of the process, as I said, make sure you have those conversations early and that is resolved adequately before an appointment is made. Just because somebody has some offending doesn't mean they definitely can't do the job. In some cases it will, depending on what the offence is and what the job is, but there will be a lot of people who have some offending background who are perfectly safe to work within the role that they've applied for. We then need to appoint the person, so we need to be very clear about when they're going to start the role and how that's going to work. And we then need to induct them. So I'm just going to bring us back together for a moment before we talk about what we do next, in case there's any questions. Does anyone have any questions on any of that? So, oh, Kate.
Oh, it's me again. You talked about having references and then doing follow-up phone calls would you recommend, advise recording those phone calls? When I worked in industry, they were actually banned because an interviewee, a candidate has a right to know and to see everything about them that's discussed. So a follow-up phone call in industry, we actually banned them. If you're doing follow-up phone calls, are you recording them? Because otherwise, if someone says, I got good references, what went wrong, you're in very difficult ground.
Yeah, so you would have the follow-up phone call, you would make a log that you'd made the phone call. You wouldn't kind of physically record the phone call, but you would, if something came out of that conversation that then caused you concern, that would need to be documented. So I would be saying to the person, you know, what you've told me raises a concern, calls into question the person's safety to do the role potentially. And I would be asking them to put that in an email for me, or I would be emailing them saying, this was my understanding from what we discussed, you know, making sure that I haven't misunderstood. Or if they weren't in agreement with any of that, you would need to make a note and say, well, actually, my understanding from the conversation I had with your reference was this, that, and the other. So it's not a secret. You would need to address it with the individual and be very clear where that information came from.
Because I've had the experience in the past where someone's written a reasonable reference, but with a question mark, rung them up and they said, well, this is wrong, but you're not allowed to say that I said so.
Yeah, and that does sometimes happen. I mean, to be honest, most of the ones I've had, the phone calls have ended up really long because the person wants to take extra time to tell me absolutely how amazing this person is and how great they're going to be in the role. So that happens much more often. But absolutely, it can be tricky and you need to be equipped for that and make sure that you're sat there with your notebook and you're ready to write some brief notes around what's been said. And again, you can get advice from Adam Bond if you end up in a tricky situation with that, or you can have a conversation with our HR team as well if it was more of an HR issue. Right, we are running out of time, so I will quickly share the rest of this with you if everyone's okay for time. So the final steps are all to do with what happens once the person is in their role. So effectively, once you've appointed them, really that's the beginning rather than the end. So we've got this need for an induction, so being very clear about who they report into and how that's going to work, how we're going to support them in their role. Then we need to have some kind of settling in period. Often it's called a probation period in paid work, but you might just call it settling in for a volunteer particularly. And then you need to think about ongoing support, which would include things like making sure that they've done any safeguarding training that is required of their role. And that's all outlined in the Safeguarding Learning and Development Framework. So really, really important that they know from the outset that's a requirement of their role and that you've got a clear plan as to when and how that's going to happen. It's also really important to have good record keeping as well. So you may not be recording everything, but if somebody's having some ongoing support, making sure that you've made records of the fact that that's happening, and if there's any concerns, making sure that that has been logged as well, so it's clear how that has been picked up with somebody. In terms of help and support for you, there is a new e-learning module on safer recruitment, which takes you through each of those steps and what they mean and why we need to do them. That's available on the Church of England training portal in the same place that you find your safeguarding basic awareness and foundation training. At the Diocese of Bristol, we are intending to support that with a workshop. So for some people, they'll do the e-learning module, but then they'll say, but I've got questions and I don't understand how that's going to work in my setting, and I'd appreciate the opportunity to work it through with colleagues. So we will offer a workshop to go alongside that. So if people want that opportunity to ask questions, that will be available. Make sure you read the new guidance and make sure you flag it up with other people who are involved in recruitment to make sure that you are covering that and ensure that you have a clear plan as to how you're going to achieve that. It's very clear in the guidance what is a you must, and it absolutely is a you must. It's not a maybe, and the issue with us not doing it is that your insurer may have an issue with that if there is an incident with somebody who hasn't been appropriately recruited. And the Charity Commission also expect you to follow appropriate safeguarding protocols. So again, you know, in terms of your charitable status, there can be difficulties if you have an incident and it's clear that you haven't been following the appropriate guidance. The guidance is available online, or you can download it and print it. But as I said earlier, if you know, fairly okay with IT stuff, I'm not super whizzy, I can work my way around it quite easily. It is quite easy to find the bits you need, and it gives you all the associated documents with each section as well, so it kind of chunks it down a bit more easily. And the safeguarding team are here to help and support as well. So, you know, where you have those individual questions, please do get in touch. So in terms of where we need to get to, make sure that you're familiar with the new guidance. Have a plan to achieve those requirements. It's not going to happen overnight, so don't have a sleepless night about it tonight. The key is just have the plan and then work your way through it. Use a risk-based approach, so go for your riskiest roles first. It's a team effort. So just because you are here today doesn't mean that you have to do all of this. So for some of you, you'll be in roles that actually your responsibility around this is more about going and telling other people that there's this new guidance and that they need to do something about it. It may not be about things that you can do within your role. And ask for help when you need it. Really, really important.